Continuing along with our investigation into direct price controls by the government, we looked at price floors. Price floors are prices that the government doesn't allow the market to find a price lower than that. Now we want to think about the opposite of that, something called a price ceiling. That is, prices are not permitted to go above that level. Examples of price ceilings? Oh, every now and then the government would intervene and put a price on it, say that prices just can't go above this level. Some metropolitan areas, some states have regulations that following a traumatic catastrophe event, like for example a hurricane, that suppliers are not allowed to raise the price of some needed commodities like milk or ice or chainsaws after these events. So there are certain times where the government will just put a maximum price and say that's it. Probably the one that is the strongest example over the history of the United States has been something called rent control. So let's think about rent controls as examples of price ceilings. We'll draw our axis system, and on the vertical axis we're going to measure price, which in this case is rent. And on the horizontal axis we're going to measure quantity, which in this case is the quantity of apartments for rent. We'll draw an original supply that looks something like this, and an original demand that looks something like this, and that gives us a market clearing price we'll label as P0, Q0. That's the price that the free market would find if left to its own devices. Now sometimes that price is deemed to be too high. So we'll take an example of rent control. Sometimes the city municipal authority will look at rents and say these rents are out of line with what the typical person can afford. I mean, if you're wealthy you can afford it, but monthly rents in Midtown Manhattan could get in the several $1,000s range. Now, some people might say, well, that's just, it's just not possible for the normal family to live there. And now and then, city councils will say, well, what we ought to do is let's just say a reasonable number is something less than that. So suppose they come along and say, we have a price ceiling that can't go above this level. So one example, for example, might be that if the prices in Manhattan were $3,500 a month, the city council might say, well, for this building, it's going to be $800 a month. They pick these, they control these prices. It's not exactly how it works. Typically, they'll announce a price, they'll announce a time and say, if this building is rent controlled, and they'll quote the price at the current price, and then as going forward, as the demand continues to grow, the clearing price would be going above what that is. That's an out of equilibrium situation. We'll do it with this picture to understand how that out of equilibrium situation looks. When you get to a situation where the amount that consumers wish to purchase, we'll call this X, the amount of apartments actually in the market, we'll call Y. You say, well, wait a minute, Larry, the apartments were there, how could this happen? Well, what happens over time is that the landlord is willing, in fact, to put Q0 units out if it can get this rent. But if the rent is some capped level lower, the landlord just doesn't, sometimes they just don't repair certain units. If the unit's plumbing goes out, or the unit has electricity problems, or the unit has some structural problem, they just won't repair it. And so what happens over time is that there's just less of these units available because no one's putting the effort into it anymore given this lower price. And so as a result, you get the situation where there's a lot of people who want the product, we'll call that X, and not very many of the units are available. Maybe you're even just giving part of your apartments to your relatives and say, well, at this price, if I can't get any more for it, at least, I'll let my son or daughter live here or something like that. Any way you look at it, this is an out of equilibrium situation. There's too much of quantity demanded and not enough quantity supplied. So how do we go about solving this problem? Well, it's a difficult issue. The market is not allowed to decide who gets what. We started our entire adventure in thinking about economics by thinking about the fact that there's scarcity. 2, there's just not enough to go around. In this case, the price ceiling has created an artificial scarcity. People want a lot more of the apartments than there are apartments to go around. Normally, price would float up to that P0 and the market would be cleared. In this case, it's not allowed for that to happen, so you see that there's not going to be very many units put on the market. At this amount, the landlords could actually, if they could get away with it, charge a really high price. Okay? At that amount, enough people willing to pay this amount, but they can't because they can't get any price higher than the price ceiling. So how does this process work? Who makes the allocation decision? Well, unfortunately, the allocation decision is made by essentially non-market forces. And so if, it's not uncommon in some cities in America to drive by a long line of people out on the sidewalk in the morning. And you ask, what's happening here? And your friend who you're staying for a few days with somebody in say, San Francisco, they'll say, well, that's a rent-controlled neighborhood. Somebody must have died. And the idea is that now there's going to be a lot of people who are going to interview for this particular apartment. And you can imagine those interview process. Those people would say, look, if I can get this apartment for only $600 a month rent, whereas the market clearing price is $3,000, I'll make sure I'll call the landlord up and say, hey, how about if I put hardwood floors in? Or how about if I put a granite countertop in? The landlord's not going to do it because he or she is now subject to this binding constraint of this low price. But if the landlord picks the tenant correctly, which may be someone who has a lot of wealth to begin with, they can actually end up subsidizing these people. The people will put a lot of their own cash into making sure the apartment stays up to code and in fact is better than code with granite and hardwood and stuff like that, which you wouldn't have had otherwise. And again, it sort of defeats the purpose of what the city was all about to begin with. The city's goal was to make the apartment cheap enough that people of all sorts of income levels, that a great diversity and population could come into this area. But the end result is, by driving down the availability of the units, you let someone else make the allocation decision, and that allocation decision based on economics would be, well, I'm going to put people in there who have the most ability to actually fix the apartment up and take care of it. Probably not the same outcome to what the city wanted. This is a tough problem. People always try to figure out how to handle this problem that prices are too high. Many cities try different approaches. Some cities, they go out by just building lots of housing units for people who have a certain level of income that's below a level. Well, you can live in these housing areas. Turns out those are not the most successful outcome. It's a way to try to attack the problem by the government. Instead of just trying to restrict price, they might try to grow the supply, but without letting the market intervene so that we can get some movement in and out of these populations, the outcome is usually not very good.